to episode 39 of, I believe, 43 episodes reviewing the CIS benchmarks to harden Windows workstations and servers. After these incredibly enjoyable GPO conversations, we're going to do more GPO conversations about browser hardening. So stay tuned for that. Hopefully coming up in the next couple months after we're done with this. So really excited to get into it. My co-host Rich from CIS looks like he is either running a little bit late or may not be making it today. But we do have special guest Heath Spencer, the CEO of Traitware. Thank you for joining us, Heath. How you doing?
I'm doing great. Excited to be here.
Awesome. And this is one of my, I always enjoy these conversations, the guests that we have. So we did have Jimmy Hatzel of previously from CyberQP come on as a vendor to talk
Yep.
about how they're aligning to CIS, and having that background vendor to vendor peer doing a webinar is a little bit different than when it's vendor to MSP. So we get to do that again here with Heath, and this time to draw another parallel. Both of us here are entrepreneurs, right? So earlier stage companies, both servicing the MSP market. And I'm really excited to kind of peel some layers of maybe how you ended up in the MSP market and more about what Traitware does. So again, thank you for being open to do this. And it's been great getting to know you.
It's been awesome, and really getting to meet you through the working group that Matt Lee put
Oh
together
yeah,
to
we
work
gotta
on
we
this.
gotta mention that.
Yes, I mean that was a big thing. We, building relationships through that, and everyone that contribute was amazing, and I can't wait to see the results that come out of that. It's going to be great. And so, yeah, getting to meet you and know you through that process is what led us to here and working on like how do we achieve CIS benchmarks.
Yes.
So a little bit about my entrepreneur history. I joke that I've been signing the front of the check since I was 25. When I was a kid, they didn't know how to diagnose dyslexia, right? And so I didn't do well in school necessarily, and said, I'm just going to go work for myself. And so built actually some brick and mortar businesses that went through the first .com boom and learned how to take those online.
Really?
Yeah, it was, the crazy enough experience of I'm old, right? So going through all of that and then learning how to have this blend of like servicing customers on the internet and in a physical location and bridging the gap between that, and then learning how to process payments and delivery. And that's where we started to see, financial crimes start to hit, even just during that, first .com boom. And so
Before you were even looking at being like a security vendor or anything, you were kind of exposed to it because you had this serial entrepreneur stay with the trends
yes.
type of mindset.
Yeah. So basically got exposed to it because we got hit with it as,
Oh, you got hit with it actually.
well, just different things and like learning. I mean, I wouldn't say we got hit at scale, but whether it was from credit card fraud or, learning how to, deal with those things in an online manner, totally a little bit different than what we're doing today. But, you build relationships doing those businesses, those lead to other opportunities, different things. Long story short, had some opportunities to sell those companies that I had founded back then. And back in 2017, got exposed to, what is now Traitware, and had the opportunity to say, what that is. We had sold a business. The company and the engineers had been doing stuff that was in like hardware / software, didn't really want to be in the hardware side of it. Ended up selling the software side off to the hardware company. So they got it all in one package, and then said, okay, well, either we split and go our own ways, or what do we want to solve for ourselves? And, we're going to talk about it a little bit in the CIS controls today, but authentication, and really it comes down to passwords. And, as I'm wearing a shirt that says passwords suck.
I saw that. I was going to call it out later. It made me laugh.
Yeah, right. Well, everybody laughs because you can't ask a single person, how do you feel about passwords? They suck, right? Like not a single person will answer differently. We all hate them. So we said, how would we solve or try to address this problem ourselves? And, in not only just for personal desires of like, I don't want to deal with them anymore. And there's got to be modern solutions to this legacy problem. And so that's what we set out to solve. And we've achieved doing that. And, some aspects of what we're doing today will come into play with these CIS controls. And then we really map to other CIS controls really well. But so that's kind of just a really quick story of we're passionate about killing the password because it's a problem.
I think that's a perfect introduction, and I do want to dive more into traitware, but you shared a personal anecdote there, and a lot of times MSPs, the ones who listen here, are entrepreneurs themselves. It is the MSP owner. I'm sure you see that when you work with MSPs. It's the first round call is with the owner a lot of the time.
Yep.
It's the entrepreneur, the similar mindset. So it's really cool for us, having also been all entrepreneurs to have those conversations. But when I asked you your background, one of the first things you opened up was just kind of a personal tidbit. Hey, dyslexia, signing the front of the check, right? Something personal, and it was relatable, right? I have my own personal things. You may not know it, but this is like a dormitory background, right? I live on a college campus. Not a lot of people know that, right?
Yep.
And it's this concept of, I guess, becoming more relatable, vulnerable, and I wanted to kind of call that out and ask you, do you always share that personal anecdote, like to other MSP entrepreneurs who are trying to sell to their clients? How important is it to be transparent and share more about yourself?
I think it's super important. I don't know that I always share it. I think it just depends on, where the conversation's going. I think there's other relatable things that come up over time. What I do share is, building, everything's built on trust and relationship, and everything is done on referral, right? If you
Mm-hmm.
think you're doing anything in this world that doesn't actually end up ever to someone giving you a personal reference, that's where it's at. And so, I've had the pleasure, the luxury, whatever words you want to tie this, the joy of raising 3 children that are now off at, young 20s to mid 20s
Mm-hmm.
age. And all 3 of them, even though this is, if you have kids, you understand it. If you don't have kids yet, you will understand it someday, or you're a child of someone else's. And if you have siblings, you understand this, how 3 different children come from the same 2 parents and they're all way different. Like each one of them is so different. And I said, and I use that as an example, I said, the only commonality in any situation is people. Like if one
Mm-hmm.
of you goes into this field, one of you goes into this field, whatever it is. So learning to communicate with people and build rapport, trust, relationship, whatever that else that is, that's the most common thread in any of your success will ever come out of doing that well. And I think that MSPs, the ones that succeed, actually build that relationship with their customers, and they really become part of their customers' team, right? They're really the
Mm-hmm.
IT department for their customer. And
Mm-hmm.
the more that they get willing to be vulnerable, make it real. Hey, we're human. We're going to make mistakes. We're not perfect, but what do we do when we make a mistake, and how do we own up to it and then move forward together, be better together out of that, as Jenny
Yep.
Easterly always says. Um, I think that
Yep.
that's, an important part. And we try to treat our MSPs with that level of relationship. Now we have that luxury right now because we are small and agile, and
Sure.
we can, and we want to do that. And I hope to maintain that same culture as we grow.
And I echo that as well. And one of the things when Senteon was really starting out, like micro small to that extent, was I was nervous to kind of share where we were. I wanted them to think we were this big, large company. And one of the times I'm an entrepreneur, sales guy. He was like, "Hey, how large you guys?" I said, "Hey, we're doing all this. It's going really well." He's like, "Oh, I was kind of hoping you were a bit smaller than that. I like to work with early stage companies so I can get that white glove service." And it made me take a step back. I was like, "Oh, my stereotype or my expectation or my assumption, which I mean, we can review the word assumption. I'm sure you've made wrong assumptions in the past. Never assume anything. Was that
Yes.
he wanted this, 24/7 internal SOC, this massive company, and reality was it wasn't. But because I had set such a transparent, relatable conversation tone, we were able to backtrack and like re-engage, and it turned into a very fruitful relationship. So I
Yeah,
really appreciate that.
right. There's a fine balance in that. I think that they want to know that you're sustainable and that you're going to be around.
Mm-hmm.
People don't want to make an investment in something that they do this lift to integrate you or whatever else it
Yep.
is, and then you aren't there next season. because you ran out of money or whatever it is. They want to know that it's going to be sustainable. I think a unique thing for what you're doing, what we're doing, there is, you go back to people, process, technology inside of all of these things. Even though our people numbers aren't huge, because it's software and we're leveraging cloud services, our ability to scale is based on, based on AWS, right? And
Yes.
based on other things, like we can add more servers and
You can add more resources, right?
Right. The resources there of that stuff and is affordable to do it. It's not like we have this major capital investment of we've got to buy machinery and we've got to buy data centers and all of these. No, we can just outsource that stuff and you can do that. So I don't think a lot of people know, like pre-pandemic, and this is not, I don't have this as 100% facts, so please don't quote me on this, but how big do you think, how big do people's perception of staffing was Zoom prior to the pandemic when they blew up?
I like this example.
They were like 10 people, right?
Yep.
That's it. And didn't matter. Like it can be used by everybody because it's software. So, and very sustainable at that measure. So that's just an example. And I can't say factually that they were 10 people.
You can say it pretty factually. So personal note to me, big Zoom fan. If you ever have a meeting with me, it will be over Zoom if I have any control. But also was one of the early investors in their IPO. Love Zoom as a company. And yes, they were that small at the beginning of the pandemic.
Right. Well, I can't say it factually, but it's pretty educated guess.
Yes, it was a good one. The other thing you shared in your story, I've never heard this, the three sibling analogy. So what we talk about in these weekly webinars is, well, in total, we talk about 1,000 different GPOs, right? It's absolutely insane. And the majority of these, especially the level 1 settings, are going to be fit across your entire board for each sibling. There are some of these settings that will maybe inhibit a certain action from being done, a certain application from working. And although you may have like a golden image, you may need to create and document exceptions, aka the differences between each kid or each department, each user. So your example there, I guess I'm talking more from a Senteon perspective because I'm going to steal that. Absolutely. Because a lot of these GPOs, people want to apply a template. I just want to deploy it via group policy and be done. I'm never going to look at it again. And the reality is, if you do that, I mean, I can't say anything's definite in security, but you are going to break something. And it is going to be a lot harder to revert those choices, figure out what broke, and all of the things that come along with the dangers of implementing a template. So loved the example, had to give a shout out and relate it to what we're talking about today.
Yeah.
The other thing you mentioned is actually how we met. So the CIS working group with Matt Lee and what Pax8 is putting together is absolutely amazing. To give that a quick highlight, I know Matt and Chris Johnson from CompTIA do share this in their public forum, so it's not, exclusive information, but they are working to kind of recreate some of these CIS controls and formulate more of a interactive, maybe not interactive, but roadmap to saying, hey, to meet this control fully, you must also do these relating controls and having more of a facilitating roadmap. You want to share more about what we're doing in that group?
Yeah, well, Matt's done an amazing job. Obviously, we contribute where we can, and there's been a plethora of extremely smart brain power on those calls. It's pretty amazing the people he gets to show up for those things and volunteer their time with it. But Matt's helper, Veronica, are doing an amazing job of showing the dependencies of, here's this control, but to actually achieve this control, you need to also be doing these 3 other things that feed. Now, some of those things are actually directly related to it. Some of them just facilitate it, those things. And so I think that he's doing a really good job creating an image-based way to see the mapping of, hey, this control is dependent on these things. Click here and see what you need to do for these 3 things to actually get here. I think he's also doing a really good job. And this really came out of from our selfish side of
Mm-hmm.
it as a vendor, and for you too, we
Mm-hmm.
participated because one of Matt's goals is to be able to take these things and drive a questionnaire
Mm-hmm.
to validate that, yes, if you deploy this solution, you then achieve these controls
Yep.
using this solution. This solution also then drives data or facilitates these other controls, right? And so it's going to help people choose the right tech stack to
Yep.
map to those in an easier way. And I'm excited to you mentioned prior to the call starting live, we were discussing other things and how it fits other frameworks
Mm-hmm.
or other compliance requirements, whether that's being CMMC or getting all the way to FedRAMP as a vendor, or just doing FTC safeguards rule as a business, and how the CIS controls map to each one of those frameworks, NIST, et cetera, to then
Mm-hmm.
achieve compliance within what your business needs to do, which I think from the private sector is then going to extend into cyber insurance, and cyber insurance will be using it to map, hey, you're doing these things. We can see it all in the CIS controls. We're writing your underwriting and your premium based on what you've got done here.
Yep. And that questionnaire, to take that a step further, and I want to dive into this a little bit more with Traitware's mindset of aligning to CIS, because that's very important for us to talk about. But you brought up cyber insurance and underwriters, right? There's a lot of these checkboxes, and what this will be, it will be a series of checkboxes to say, are you doing this? Are you doing this? But as vendors, as people who are providing or facilitating or partially or completely helping you meet that safeguard or that control, we as vendors, it becomes to become partially our responsibility to be able to provide you reports that can prove that it's being done.
Yeah.
And this is more of a trend from my point of view on how vendors need to mature and potentially grow. And I mean, that's the whole point of why we're doing this, right? Continuous improvement. Rely on your vendor. Ask your vendor, hey, I need to prove I'm doing this. I know I'm doing it with your tool. What can you give me so that I can show someone else? And I do
Yeah.
believe that's a trend for vendors. Mm-hmm.
Well, it is, and it's actually starting to be called out in the fine print of different compliance requirements.
Mm-hmm.
So if you dive into the FTC safeguards rule a little bit,
Mm-hmm.
obviously there's a lot of controls that map exactly to a cyber insurance form that then
Mm-hmm.
map into these, CS controls, et cetera. But in the fine print, you'll actually read there, they want logging and attribution of, hey, so MFA needs to be enforced. Well, how are you logging that? Are you using centralized identity management to actually say, hey, Zach logged in. He also was using MFA per the logs
Yes.
to access this asset. Don't ask Matt what is an asset, because that'll go on for hours. But that they're actually starting to call out the ability to attest that you're using the control in the compliance requirements. And I
Mm-hmm.
know that Tim Golden over at Compliance Scorecard,
Yep.
that's his entire mission, is to be able to give you that. Here's your documentation. Here's your policy. Here's the tools you are using to achieve these, and these actually line up here and here. And he's doing some great things too.
Absolutely. And shout out to Tim Golden as well. He's a recurring guest on this series and a recent CompTIA, I think, Cybersecurity Leader Award. I don't remember the
Yeah,
exact title, but shout out to you, Tim Golden. I know you're out there. But very cool. Let's dive into this. We got entrepreneurship, we got CIS. Let's switch over more back to Traitware.
yep,
Give us a little bit of a overview of what Traitware is doing. You've mentioned passwords, you've mentioned authentication. At a high level, intro that, and then I have some follow-up questions.
totally. So at a high level, in the 30-second spiel is, we believe modern technology should allow you to authenticate to an asset, whatever you need to sign into, with zero shareable secrets.
Mm-hmm.
Meaning you don't have to remember, store, maintain, change, rotate a password, or what should be a secret
Mm-hmm.
ever again. And that the MFA should be built into the technology, so it's single step, It's native upon account creation. So the moment you're registered to an account, the MFA is there. So there's zero gap in coverage, right? So most legacy systems, you have to create an identity for a user, and then the user has to go register their second authentication factor on their own. It's user dependent, not admin centric. And they have to do it after the account's created. So it's two steps, and it's separated from the administrator deploying an identity to the user registering it. And we believe that should all be done in one single step, and move you to reduce friction for the user, which then by default reduces the chance they can make a mistake, because you've improved their process. We're going back to the whole conversation of we're humans, we're going to make mistakes. And because of that human nature, there's some great comedy routines out there that joke about these things. But if we're honest with ourselves, how many of us use a similar sequence to generate a password if we're creating it? If we're not using an automated system to create it, if we're creating it, we tend to use a similar thing and then maybe change the front end and the back end of it very slightly, because it's just, we like to use the word we're efficient, but it's just lazy.
Don't forget the addition of the explanation point. I mean, that's key.
It is. You've watched Michael McIntyre's routine on the password, and so yes. What do you mean it's not strong enough? And I got to do what? I won't do it any justice, so I'm not going to repeat it. But people can go watch it on their own. But yeah, so we believe that modern technology should fix something that has really been broken since it was the passwords or secrets have been around since the dawn of man.
Yes.
However, they've really been used in a digital format for gated access control to an asset in a documented format since 1961 at MIT. And the crazy part is those were MIT students. So, of course, one of them figured out how to break it really quickly. That's all documented. Go read the story on your own. But it's been broken since it was built, and we should have fixed it a while ago, but it's fixed now. And
technology is catching up. We have leaders like Heath in the space, and not only in the space, you are in the MSP space as a vendor.
Yes.
I'm not asking you to go too deep into revenue share, but as far as I know, you primarily service the MSP market. Now that is something Senteon does as well, but we didn't actually know about the MSP space when we started. We kind of fell into it from a need that they had, and we solved. And I'm curious kind of your origin story of falling into the MSP space. Is it similar where it was an accident, or was this a plan?
Well, so some of it, we actually tried to go towards the MSP space because of personal relationships prior. So I have friends that own MSPs that I knew prior. My other prior businesses used MSPs, and I knew local MSPs that were managing other SMBs that we had worked and partnered with. So I knew about them. And that model made total sense to me to be able to facilitate them going out and doing sales and enablement for clients that they already had, and how do we improve that experience without having to staff up a ton of salespeople on our own, or support or enablement for direct customers. What we discovered is we had to have some measure of direct sales so that we could refine our enablement process, refine our repeatable sales process, all of those things.
You had to know what it was like to sell to a user, right? You had to understand that entire buyer's journey to better service the MSP space.
Correct. So we have direct sale customers out there, but it's not our primary focus of go to market, especially now that we've been growing within the MSP space. We really want to take that MSP channel approach. And I also firmly believe that if you're an MSP today, you can no longer really be just an MSP. You have to be almost an MSSP because of the risks associated with cyber security today. Like it is very difficult to be arm's length with just break fix. And as everything moved to the cloud, really just going, installing a local network and doing those kinds of things, you had to change your business model. So how do you facilitate deploying something securely in the cloud and doing that as your business model? So I think the timing's great for the MSP to do this. And then I think that they're quickly recognizing that their customers can't go get contracts without cyber insurance today.
Sure.
So if you got a map to cyber insurance, you might as well map controls like CIS using technologies like Senteon and Traitware to go help you do that.
Thanks for the shout out there.
Yeah.
But no, that's really good. Thanks for sharing that. That's always something I'm curious about when entrepreneurs make their company, and I think it's really cool. You want it to learn that buyer's journey to better service the audience you want it to serve. So awesome to hear that. Earlier you did mention you've really tossed the word legacy and a few other things having to do with defaults, right? Defaults are bad. I
Yep.
think that was more in our pre-show than anything else we were saying that. But a lot of these CIS recommendations that we talk about, Microsoft comes with them as default available, whether that's the legacy authentication process, the way passwords are stored, right? So I'm curious for you to kind of talk about what's your point of view on defaults, and if an MSP were to use Traitware, like, is this mitigating some of the default legacy risk with their Windows systems?
So, everything comes down to configuration, which is what we're going to talk about in your slides, is how do you configure things properly, and exactly what you guys check for is, having, the right images in place, right? In those kinds of things. And then defaults are okay in certain environments, and they drive efficiency, convenience, right? However, they also leave the door open for risk, right? And so we have to, if you look at these things as like, how do you deal with your everyday life? Like, imagine, you buy a home and it had default settings of none of the windows were, pun intended.
The key for the door is the same as everyone else's default key.
Yes, which is where I was headed. Like, it's your windows don't have any latches on them, so your windows can go up or down or sideways, however your windows open, up vertically or horizontally. Or yes, everyone has the same cookie cutter key. Now, what's not known, maybe I shouldn't share this, is if you are a recreational power sports user, like you like a side-by-side or a snowmobile or dirt bike, what a lot of people don't know is that in the OHV world, there's really only about 7 variations of the keys for those things. So, there's a 1 in 7 chance that your key works in the machine down the road, right? And that's not a good thing. And so, but yeah, that's the default setting for those things. And so it also, that applies to like tractors, right? There's only, like, if you have a Caterpillar backhoe, there's a high probability that your key works in the other company's backhoe. Just saying. And that's an example of a real world default to make it convenient, especially or cost production from the manufacturer, all of those things. So it behooves you to change those default settings to try to protect your asset.
And to take that even a step further, I always get the question, or just the question is posed, why does Microsoft leave everything this way? Well, let's look at it from the real example you just provided. Cost savings, right? If they leave everything available, no one's going to reach out to them and say something's not working, because everything is going to work because it has maximum access, maximum legacy protocols available, right? So same as the manufacturers of these equipment, right? It's quicker to just have the same key. It's easier on the back end. But at the same time, now you have a lot more access, which is a lot riskier. And if you are a security-minded owner of this equipment, maybe you do want to pay for the upgrade for a custom key, whatever that takes.
Well, real world problems right now. I mean, we're kind of jumping slightly off topic, but shareable secrets are very convenient for most MSPs because they can just share a access control across different support engineers to access something, and they don't have to create unique identities at scale to do that, right? It's a scaling problem. Now, there are modern solutions, whether it's a solution like ours or other companies like Tech ID Manager, et cetera, that are solving for those things and can help you move away from those shareable secrets. But it's a real world example that's very hits close to home for the MSP space.
Yep. I think that was really good. Well, that was kind of the first half. Let's start to get to the more educational portion of the show. If we
Yeah.
can pop open the first slide here, we'll get into the MITRE attack technique. So I always like to emphasize here, these default settings, the things we're going to talk about today, is all about mitigating risk, right? This is just a quick, short list of certain MITRE attack techniques that are known to be mitigated if you do harden and change these settings. So the first one here, modify authentication process. I mean, Heath, this is all you do. You're an authentication guy, right? If a bad actor is able to change that authentication process, how much easier is it for them to get in?
Well, yeah. So, I mean, typically when they're modifying the authentication process, they're creating their own backdoor, right? So
Mm-hmm.
they're trying to create some way that they can come and go without you noticing that they're coming and going. They want to lurk in the background for as long as possible without them knowing. So, if they open up a different, you know, channel, a port,
Mm-hmm.
a process to authenticate. These days, we're even seeing them, add their own. If you have a policy that allows a user to register more than one MFA token, they'll go and get someone's credentials and then they'll add their own MFA token and they have access then, right? So those are just broad examples of it. But at the core level within Windows, you want to restrict or limit the ability to allow someone to modify the authentication process so that if a threat actor did get someone's credentials,
Mm-hmm.
then they can't go change it to create their own access.
Absolutely. And, I liked your password manager example with the 2FA, right? I mean, those that key may be accessible, right? They might take that and do more damage. I mean, these passwords, whether it's a call in to help desk, I don't know, the MGM story. I mean, that was
Yep.
all just calling in, getting the information they wanted, and going the direction they needed to, right? So by having these settings in place, you can't eliminate risk. Traitware, Senteon, we're not the silver bullet, but all we're doing is mitigating the risk of these attacks being successful, not of
Yep.
them coming in. They're going to happen, but we're mitigating the risk of them being successful.
Yeah. How do you actually reduce the chance that they're going to get to the gold, which in most
Mm-hmm.
cases is the data? How do you, you mentioned MGM and that was social engineering through
Yep.
phone calls, et cetera, recovered someone's account. How could you have reduced the blast radius that the threat actor
Yes.
could actually successfully get all the way to the gold?
Yep. Absolutely. Layered security. That's what this is all about. The other one here, I like to call out the public facing applications because we are going to be talking about traffic today and unencrypted traffic and everything. I mean, how important is it to make sure your public facing applications are actually secure and accepting only what they need to accept?
Oh, it's critical, and as we go through the slides and we talk about, whether you're doing that communication over with encryption
Mm-hmm.
or without encryption, um, it again is about reducing the chance that someone in the middle, a threat actor, a bad actor, could somehow capture that communication, which then could lead to them having access, right? So
Yep.
you have to grant access to people to be able to do their jobs. The risk is in if someone either advertently or inadvertently allows that access key, whatever that is,
Mm-hmm.
to go be used in the communication channels. Not only where does those keys live and how are they stored, encrypted or not, which we're
Mm-hmm.
going to discuss in the slides
Yep.
today, but the transmission of them, is it decipherable in that transmission?
Yep, that's perfect. And speaking of the slides, I think we can we'll start going into them. I guess before I really transition fully here, is there any other just kind of attack trends or anything you're seeing that you want to call out, or maybe a really good technique that Traitware helps mitigate? Is there anything you want to add to this slide?
Well, so I mean, we really help address man in the middle attacks. We
Mm-hmm.
really address what's been currently with legacy MFA, which is a password plus a other fact, one-time password, which is two shareable secrets, or even if they are using like an accept decline, prompt, those have all been in headline news recently where, whether it's through credential stuffing that triggers prompt bombing, you only need one accidental accept and that person's in. Or if it's two shareable secrets like an OTP through social engineering, et cetera, the threat actors are capturing that, or they're getting their primary credentials and then registering their own OTP if they're allowed to register more than one. So we really help address that. We've got some processes that extend beyond that and even will address like session jacking or
Sure.
an evil Genix proxy attack where they're actually trying to capture the return identity payload. So there's a lot of things, and I don't want to jump into the weeds on that stuff right now, but there's a lot of modern ways you can address these problems and reduce the chance that your user can make a mistake. And there's, when you look at people, process, and technology, we're never going to solve 100% of the people problem. Like if you have someone that's a disgruntled employee or a contract worker that's maybe making 15 grand a year overseas and they can make 10x of their yearly salary in selling their credential or access, that gets really difficult to stop. But can you do things with modern technology to reduce the chance of the success, as you mentioned, that actually allows them access to the gold? Yes, you can.
That is perfect and sounds a little too real. Sounds like you've maybe come across stories like that in the past.
Yes.
I do love that you don't want to go into the weeds. This is a highly educational series, but I do want to ask a little follow-up question to that. When you do work with MSPs, do you ever call out certain techniques, like the technical discussion that we're not going to get into today, but do you call out certain attacks? Do you encourage the MSP to talk about these attacks to their end client? Like how technical do you go with your prospects?
It depends on the client and the prospect, and the MSP really needs to understand their client, right? They need to have that personal relationship with it, and they need to understand what's going to be the why driver for that customer to make a change. Because anytime there's change, there's some friction. Do we try to reduce that friction as much as possible? Absolutely. But there's always going to be some friction, and there's also going to be questions of like, okay, well, if I force my user to do this, can they still do their job, right? And you mentioned this earlier before we even started the call, or one of our prior conversations of there's always going to be exceptions that you have to allow for in different things. Like we've got a current customer deployment right now that isn't giant. Let's say it's around 150 users. Well, they have a small subset of users that are accessing something a certain way, but they're willing to accept that level of risk for just those users, right? And they only have access to certain things. And as long as you're using privilege access management or role-based access controls, et cetera, in that, maybe they're only accessing sales tools that have lower risk of the gold of what someone might be trying to get to, then you have to allow for that. So it's really helping the MSP understand there is nothing perfect. There's things that are going to have to be out there, but how do we do remote, if we can address 140 users and remove the chance that they get phished and you only have 10 left, why would you not at least do the 140 first?
Yes.
Because you've addressed 90+% of your risk in doing those. And then you deal with the other 10 as you can, if there's something that's holding them up from technology debt or whatever. But don't wait to reduce risk just because you've got one thing that isn't perfect, right? And so it's really helping the MSPs learn that, but it's also helping them understand what's not visible to most businesses is the soft cost expense of, do you really know how upset your users are that they have to change their password every 90 days? Do you know how frustrated they get when they accidentally fat finger typing in this one-time code and then have to repeat it over and over and they can't just get their job done? Like we've all experienced that frustration. What's that worth to you? And what's it worth to you to help those people reduce that friction and then be able to just get their job done? So there's things like that, starting to really understand the soft side of it, which is the people.
Yep. I think that's definitely hard for all of us to really identify what are those soft things and bridging that conversation. So kudos to you on figuring that out and really starting to do that. Yeah, no, I really appreciate it. I always love getting to talk to you because we always go on such good tangents. But let's go ahead and kick off on some of these more technical settings.
Yeah.
As a reminder, CIS benchmarks do assist in securing your system because these are all just the recommendations. You have to change these defaults. I've beat this like a dead horse. We have 13 settings to get to, so let's hit this first slide. All right. So the first one is to enable MPR notifications for the system. And again, group policy, man, it says enable. The recommendation is disable. Take your time doing this. Use a tool like Senteon to help you implement these. Or if you're doing it manually, read it completely, digest it, watch the webinar with Heath. But Heath, please introduce this setting and why we maybe want to keep this disabled.
Yeah. So, this type of setting is really around alert fatigue at some measure, right? And it creates just a lot of traffic, and you want to know, to go off on another tangent right now, do you actually know the source of where things are coming in from? And there's a lot of discussion around a lot of the AI with large language learning models right now, and where are they actually getting the information that they're giving back to you? And is it from a trusted source or a verified source? And so having these multiple provider routes of things coming into your system, again, communication and everything, you want to narrow that down so that you actually know the sources that are providing you in your system critical information.
And I think you said this when you started explaining the setting, but a lot of this is eliminating the noise. That end client at the machine level doing, their sales software, doing accounting software, they're not going to need these notifications. So don't let them see it, right?
Yep.
A lot of these settings, we talk about hardening. Hardening is inherently a scary word, but by controlling these settings, and I said the word in the sentence, which I didn't want to do, the MSP is actually gaining more control about controlling your network, controlling what's going on. And that's going to be the best way to not only minimize your risk, but understand your risk. And in order to run a business, there is inherently risk you have to accept.
Absolutely. There's risk in anything we do. I mean, just crossing the street to go get lunch has some measure of risk in it, right? And so, I think the other thing we don't think about in these settings too is that if you're allowing lots of alerts or noise to come into your end users on their endpoint, that is a path that the threat actors will use to try to trick them into taking an action. Getting an alert can create a sense of urgency. What's popping up on my screen and I need to do what about it? And it creates confusion, and it allows the door for going back to people and the people process technology part of it, your technology could be opening the door to your people making a mistake. If they don't need to see those alerts, don't let them.
Absolutely. All right, let's go over to this next setting here. Sign in and lock last interactive user automatically after a restart is set to disabled here. So if you could introduce this setting and the risk it might mitigate.
Yeah, so basically you want to make sure that it is enabled and that it's not
It's a
set to
good
disabled.
old word choice for that. Yes.
Yes, it's tricky, basically, wordplay games on here. And, going back to our earlier discussion around Windows probably leaves this set to disabled for convenience, right? They want to make it easy for a user just to go back in and do their job. And if someone wants to add a level of friction to increase security, this does add some friction, right? It adds anytime, whether it's a screen timeout or whatever else it was, it's going to force you to re-authenticate. It's verifying you are the user that should be signing into this at some level, depending on whether or not you've got MFA there or whether or not you're doing it. It could be you left your password on a Post-it note underneath the keyboard and anyone can use it, but at least it's forcing someone to enter those credentials to sign in versus leaving the door open. This also, if it doesn't lock, then it's allowing the systems to just run all the time, which is using up resources, whatever else, but also leaves it where if a threat actor, gets into the machine and things are just already running. And especially if you're not running as a regular user and you were running as an admin, that they can go do lots of things. Referencing back to a Matt Lee thing, he's got a whole entire campaign on lock it up. And there's lots of people going around lots of conferences and airports and coffee bars and wherever else. And you'd be surprised how many people walk away from their machine with the screen open and still unlocked.
Not only normal people, but also employees with their business machines is even more interesting.
Yeah. And so this is critical. Lock it up.
Yep. And one more thing, just to emphasize on these difficult GPOs and the word choice they have. This is saying like sign in and lock is set to disabled, because if this is enabled, the user will stay signed in even though it's locked. By disabling this, this will sign them out and lock.
Yes.
It's a lot. All right, next setting here. Turn on PowerShell script block logging is set to enabled. I always intuitively think more logs is usually better, especially if you have a SIM that can sift through the noise. But why is this one so critical, Heath?
Well, so it depends on what you're actually logging, and you want to, again, you don't want too much noise. You don't want too much things to sift through. You want to make sure you're sifting through the right things. But the other side of it is that if you're logging certain things when you're running certain programs and you had to enter credentials when you were running that and it logs or stores that entire process, if someone gets into where that's being stored, and depending on how it's being stored, they could find access keys in that log, right? And that's really what it's about. It's about how do they get the access keys to then go do other actions and move laterally from there. That's one of the vulnerabilities that I see in this, is that if you're logging everything that's running in the background, not only are you going to end up with a bunch of stuff that you don't need, but there's a chance that there was some nuggets of gold in one of those logs that someone else that's lurking around could find.
Yep. Perfect. And I think this is going to tie into right into this next setting here. And you said part of the explanation here, but turn on PowerShell's transcription is set to disabled. Again, it's minimizing the amount of nuggets they might be able to find. But is there more you want to add to this? But you did a good job summarizing kind of both. But anything else?
Yeah, these two kind of tie together, right? In that transcription is like, if you're on a video call like this and you're running transcription, it's generating plain text notes of what we're saying, right? Well, if you're running transcription on these things, it's creating plain text notes of that. And again, if there's nuggets of gold in those notes that you don't want someone getting, if you need to run this to do a debugging session or whatever that is, then you want to know about it. Then you want to grab that transcription, use it, and either erase it after or then store it very securely so that a threat actor can't get to it.
Yeah, absolutely. That's perfect. And we do have about, I think, 6 more settings and about 12 minutes left. So I do want to take our time, but we're going to switch into the, I think, authentication settings here now. So the first one here, allow basic authentication is set to disabled. Looking at this in an isolated view, this kind of seems backwards, which we'll get into that in these later slides. But Heath, why do we not want basic authentication?
Well, basic authentication, so, going back to why we created Traitware, is that it's basic authentication is really related to password-based, legacy-based authentication. It's very simple. It doesn't rely on MFA. It doesn't rely on anything else. And the way that it stores the secret in the system could be in plain text, which goes into some of the other controls that we're going to talk about here momentarily. But you need to move beyond how you want to create very secure storage of the secrets, and basic authentication doesn't do that.
Yep, that is absolutely perfect. And speaking of those other settings, this next one here is allow unencrypted traffic is set to disabled. Man, you read that one and that one makes sense right out of the gate. But again, Heath, educational. Why do we not want unencrypted traffic?
Well, I mean, for most of the regular people, I mean, it's mostly MSPs that are listening to this, so they should understand the difference between an HTTPS and an HTTP website.
Yes.
You don't see too many websites these days that don't have certificates and that aren't delivering encryption. But the reasons that you wouldn't want that is that once something leaves your possession and it's communicating over the airwaves, over the wire, etc., how that's being delivered from one
Yes.
source to another relying party, if it's not encrypted, then anyone using very simple tools these days could read those communications, right? So it's, if we go back to being kids and trying to yell into a can over a string, not too much of it actually went through the string, and the person sitting over the fence could probably actually hear you. And so it's just being communicated in a way that anyone could intercept that conversation. And so you want to make sure that things are being communicated where only the person it's intended for has the ability to decrypt that communication and then read it or
That's
unsend.
perfect. And that's one of my favorite things, having other entrepreneurs or really customer facing guests on the show, because I swear I'm always the worst one at metaphors in the room when people like Heath come on the show. Absolutely great with the can and a string. One word choice, not really a buzzword, but one thing I'm surprised you didn't say here is the words data in transit. But that's exactly, to
Yeah,
summarize what Heath was talking about, is making sure that data in transit is going to where it's supposed to and is not getting moved or looked at.
correct. Yeah.
So,
By
all right,
default,
let's.
that's what it's the data, it's the gold that's moving from one place to the next, right? Where it was stored to then where it's going to for somebody else to consume it.
Yep, absolutely. All right, this next setting here, disallow digest authentication is set to enabled. So this is saying we do not want digest authentication. Is this another legacy one, or what is this,
It
Heath?
is, and it really it goes back to this is going back to the old days of IIS, Internet Information, Security frameworks, and how things were actually done over older HTTP communications when it all first started. But you know how they came up with digest it, I think it was whoever built these things that was trying to figure out, well, how does it process this information once it arrives somewhere? And this is going back to when you dig into the weeds of it, it's plain text. And digest authentication is communicating really in plain text communication. It's not encrypted. So very similar to that data in transit, the data or where the secrets of authentication are being used would be in plain text if you're allowing digest authentication.
Perfect. Awesome. All right, and this next setting, I think I accidentally had a duplicate slide. So if we can go over two settings here, because we did talk about this one. So this one here is allow remote server management through WinRM is set to disabled. So anything with remote management is always scary to me reading, but explain why we wouldn't want to allow this through the WinRM service.
Yeah, so through WinRM service, you don't want to allow it as an open default because then it would be pretty easy for a threat actor to find a way to get in through that door. It'd be like leaving your back door unlocked and yet you locked the front door. And so they just walk around the back door and go in. So the remote management is tricky. It's one of the biggest vulnerabilities. We have to have it in places for people, but you want to make sure you're doing that in a secure method. WinRM is not one of those secure methods, so you want to make sure it's turned off and that you're locking the back door.
And I'm sure I am going to start doing some parallel episodes, kind of diving into some of these topics more in depth. But I mean, this is effectively, RMMs have the capabilities of remoting in and doing that a certain way, and that can be an incredible attack vector, right? If an RMM is compromised.
Well, if someone gets an MSP admin's access to the RMM tool, they most likely then have access to any customer that support engineer is an admin for. So it is a really big risk, and you need to somehow mitigate the
Mhm.
blast radius for that exposure. But at the same point, how do you deliver or authorize making sure that they have 100% uptime if you can't have remote access? You've got to.
Absolutely. And I mean, talking about that scope, I think Tim Golden was the guest when we talked about RDP settings, but making sure you're leveraging your RMM in the most secure way, not
Absolutely.
allowing for a lot of these default configurations to be available, but to still use, I mean, that is a single point of failure, right? It's a single point of risk, which is, it's an accepted risk. You need it
It's
for this multi-tenancy,
it's a
but at
known
this,
it's a known risk, and then how do you address that risk as best as possible?
yes. And what we talk about in these webinars week after week, get rid of these defaults, harden the systems so you can perform and accept the risk without accepting additional risk that is not necessary. So
Yep.
wanted to emphasize that on this slide, but let's
Yeah.
keep on moving through. Did I duplicate some of these slides? This is a little embarrassing. We already talked about this one too, didn't we?
Yep.
Man, all right. This next one here, disallow WinRM from storing run as credentials is set to enabled. So we do not want WinRM to even store the run as credentials. Could you talk to us about this?
Yeah, so the run as credentials, most people, that's where you need elevated access controls. If you're running as a regular user and you get a prompt that says, hey, you need admin password to do this action, storing that in WinRM would allow that by default, right? So by default, if the password is, for that elevated access is stored in WinRM, it could automatically do it, which would then give the threat actor the ability to use this access and that stored credential that's already there. So maybe the threat actor figured out how to get themselves onto the machine because you didn't disable WinRM to begin with, but then you also allowed them to then run scripts as the admin because they stored the password. So that's a bad idea also. If you're going to use WinRM, don't store the credentials.
At minimum, at least
At minimum.
eliminate this layer.
Yes.
No, that's absolutely perfect. And as I said, I love getting to have other vendor entrepreneurs, especially because we do have a lot of the same background. We've overcome a lot of the same challenges. And end of the day, we're both servicing a different layer of security, and we work together to make the MSP's processes and security more enhanced. But that was the last setting since I don't have any more duplicates to skip
Yeah.
over. Apologize about that. I will review the deck a little bit more closely next week. But Heath, we have a couple minutes left. I like to leave these few minutes just to any final takeaways, thoughts you want to leave with the audience, anything you really want to share here.
Really, it's just advocating for the MSPs to go look at the CIS controls, really start talking to your customers about the CIS controls, how the CIS controls will help them get more secure, that they can no longer leave their head in the sand. If they're connected to the internet at all, you are on the playing field, period. And the MSPs really need to own that communication to their customers, and that the CIS team, and then people like Matt Lee and the work that they're doing to enable the MSPs to have a clearer picture of how to then map the right tools in their tech stack to the CIS controls, and then how those controls will map to all the different frameworks, whether it's this customer needs to meet FTC, this customer needs to meet FedRAMP, et cetera, or whatever else it is. It's really, I'm excited about the work that's being done there, and then excited about the work that other vendors like Tim Golden and Compliance Scorecard are doing to empower the MSPs to really serve their customers well. And this has got to be a team sport. We have to it's hurting our economy. In how much money the people are making from doing things poorly, and it's just too convenient for them to do it today.
Yep.
So we got to add some friction, and the CIS controls can get you there. And then choose companies that are taking it seriously to map to those, right? That choose companies that are doing the work to help you get there.
That's the biggest thing. Vendors today are going to have to step up if we're going to continue to exist. So shout out to Traitware, shout out to ourselves, right? We can shout ourselves out on our own show. But thank you for joining the show. Thank you for talking about CIS and being part of that working group. I mean, That's the only way we can continue to improve. And I believe there's a lot of opportunity for vendors to start working together, to start demonstrating how Senteon does not compete with Traitware. We are complementary. It's important
Absolutely.
to have multiple solutions in your security stack. Do what you can with the tools you have, but for things like password lists, configuration management, to the extent that we do it, it's not really a manual process. You don't have the tools, and purchasing security solutions, if managing appropriately, is a pretty good move. But
It
Heath,
is.
mhm,
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I would add, just another analogy, right, or metaphor is that there's a time and a place for convenience that a Swiss Army knife can get the job done, but there's also a time and place to have a very dedicated, specific knife to do the job because it just does it that much better. A utility tool that can do it all usually has some not great failure points.
I like that. Another good metaphor. All right, guys, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate you guys joining for the weekly webinar. As you can see, we have 3 more episodes coming up of this series. We have Corey White, Tim Schnurr, and Joshua Copeland to close out the season 2 on workstation server hardening. Browser hardening settings coming up after these 3 episodes. Those dates are to be determined. I'm thinking I'll launch in June, but we will see how much bandwidth I have to make the slides. I do try to summarize each of these weekly webinars in our newsletter. Please feel free to check that out via my profile. And you can actually view our profile here on the next slide. And always happy to connect. Heath, please toss your LinkedIn into the event as well below. And Senteons, thank you to everyone viewing and everything. We want you to understand where you sit today. Scan the QR code, understand where you sit with CIS today with the benchmarks, and we'll show you where you are and show you how to fix those. So thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Heath. And